Welcome to Candid Conversation number 213. Today we're going to talk about the beauty of war. People don't like to go to war and talk about all the destruction. I know there have been people say that religion has created all kinds of war, and war is always given in a bad context. And I mean, it's not that I love war. No one loves war. It's just, you get people that are killed and you have to fight, and it's not, it's not a good thing. But it is a good thing in light of the depravity of man. Because you look at what man did, there was no war at first. God created the free will of man, and man used that free will to sin. God created marriage. He created family, and even with the checks of a spouse and kids to the free will still got so bad that, as it says in Genesis 6, every thought of man's heart was only evil continually. Man had gotten so wicked that there was really no one left to save. I mean, you look at how bad it was. 2 Peter mentions that, how it talks about the long suffering of God waited during the days of Noah, in which 8 souls were saved by water. The world was so bad, and its depravity, its evilness, its wickedness. There was only one man, Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and God had him, as a 500-year-old man, no less, spend 100 years building the ark. I mean, God could have just saved him. He could have just did like he did with Enoch. He looked at Enoch, and Enoch walked with God, and God says, okay, I'm taking you up to be with me. It's been very easy for God to do it that way. But he has Noah work 100 years building an ark. And the reason, 2 Peter tells us, is by doing it that way, 7 other souls were saved, Noah's family. I mean, God is so desirous for people to be saved that he is willing to suffer long. It says the long suffering of God waited. The book of Habakkuk says that God cannot behold evil. He's so holy. He's so pure. He can't even behold evil. And so when evil goes on in the world, God suffers through it. It's just sort of like you think of, you have a child. It probably pains you as a parent to see your child in prison, on drugs, or whatever bad things the child does. It's a lot of pain for you. Well, think if you have millions of children and all of them disobeyed you. Think of the suffering you would go through then. But God says, in his knowledge, he says, there are 7 people on this earth. There's only one that recognizes me right now, but there are 7 other people here that if I get Noah to work for me for 100 years in building this ark, they're going to believe. And so he has him build the ark. 8 people are saved through the flood. God starts all over with Noah and his family after the flood, destroys every other person on the earth. And so then it happens again. Genesis 11 says the whole world was united against God. It was one language, one speech. God looks at the earth and he says, they're united against me. If I don't do something, nothing will be impossible for them to do. And it's not that God was saying, I want to keep man from becoming like me. It's that he saw man wouldn't become like him. Man would become like Satan. Because every thought of man's heart was only evil continually. That's how Satan was in Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 14. He says, I will make my throne on the sides of the north. I will be like the Most High God. It's all about Satan's will, and he had completely neglected God's will. And that's where man was, and God says, if I don't do something, there won't be anybody worth saving. But this time he doesn't destroy the earth. He divides the world into nations, creating different language groups. That's how the people got where they are. Native American Indians were in the United States when we settled here. Well, how did that happen? How did the black people get into Africa and the Indians get into the United States? And how did all these people get in their different countries? Well, originally, God scattered them like that. And it was God creating those nations to keep man from destroying himself through his evil. It was creating that national pride. Basically, God created nations, and what resulted through that, the evilness of man, is that man's response in the flesh, because man only does wickedly in his heart, man's response in the flesh to nations is to have war against each other. And so that's why the war is so great, because it's an awful thing that people get killed and all that, but it's great in the sense of, if God never created nations, there wouldn't have been war. And if there wasn't war, we never would have lasted this long. From Adam to Noah, I think it's 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and the whole world is evil. And then from Noah to the Tower of Babel, I believe it's 5 generations. If God destroys the world after those 5 generations, how long is it going to be before he has to do that again? 2 generations? Then 1 generation? It seems to be getting faster. So God creates nations so that man can have war with each other. And what that does is it keeps man from uniting against God. Everybody has their own bias. England is a perfect example. Back in the 1500s, 1600s, you'd have a person ascend to the throne. She'd be a Catholic, so now she's killing the Protestants. Then another guy would ascend to the throne, and he'd be a Protestant, so then he'd kill the Catholics. And you think, that's so bad that would happen. Well, yeah, it is, but what it does is it kept the Catholics from getting really bad, and it kept the Protestants from getting really bad. Because the people you end up killing are the ones who are the head of the religion, the ones, the top ones. You got to go after them to get rid of that religion. And religion is just, as 2 Corinthians 10 says, it's just imaginations and every high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of God. That's what the world was doing in Genesis 11 when they built the Tower of Babel. God says, the whole world is in rebellion against me. I already destroyed the earth before, 5 generations before, because of your rebellion. I'm going to have to do it again. I'm going to have to, but this time, I can't just keep, I love man, I want them to be saved. I can't just keep destroying the earth. So he divides them into nations, and man, in his rebellion, says, you're not God over me. I am going to, and you notice from Genesis 11, the reason they built the Tower of Babel, it says they are going to make a name for themselves, lest they be scattered abroad. They think that they can do anything, that God cannot stop them. And when God threatens to scatter them abroad, he says, that man says, that's not going to happen. Man says, I am going to build a Tower of Babel. I'm going to build a tower to reach into heaven. Satan said, I will be like the Most High. I will sit on the throne on the sides of the north. That's what man was trying to do. Man says, I'm going to be God. I'm going to sit on the sides of the north. I'm going to sit up there. And so man builds that tower. And of course God scatters him because God realizes, well, man's going to succeed. Not that he's going to overthrow God, but that he will succeed in his rebellion against God, and then God can't save him. And another part of this that you see in the nationalism is what it does is it creates all these different religions, each nation having their own religion, and then they fight against each other in the name of that religion. That's really what nationalism does. Because when you look at the Tower of Babel, for example, the whole earth was of one language, one speech, and they were all of one mind, and that one mind was to go against God. So they must have recognized that God exists. They knew there was only one God, and he was the one you either worship him or you don't. And so they end up rebelling against, they unite their, why does that guy keep flashing me? I'm going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. So man goes in his rebellion against God. But look at what man does today. Now that we have nationalism, we have all these different religions. So the Middle East, they worship Allah. The United States worship a God of their own choosing. I mean, they call him Jesus, they call him the Christian God, but they don't follow the Bible, so that's what Paul considers another Jesus. There is the people who follow Hinduism, Buddhism. And so, in other words, if man had knowledge of just one God, the true God, and man then could unite against that one true God, then their fight wouldn't be with each other. There wouldn't be war. Their fight would be with God. And as God says in Genesis 11, nothing will be impossible for man. Man will succeed in overthrowing God. Not that God wouldn't be God anymore, but they would succeed in overthrowing God's ability to save man. That man would become so evil without the nationalism. Their evilness, as seen at the Tower of Babel, they would be united against God and try to overthrow God. So what God does is he creates nationalism. So now, at the same time, people don't have the knowledge of God anymore. Romans 1 talks about God gave them over to a reprobate mind. That was a state van flashing his lights at me, wanting me to go over the speed limit, probably so they could give me a ticket. Corrupt government for you right there. See, I'm not against God, I'm against the government. See how that works? But, so, what God does is he gets man by creating nationalism. Well, and then man now defends his own nation against other nations. And they do so by having their own religion. I mean, the Japanese have their own religion. Chinese have their own religion, Confucianism. Each nation is identified basically by their own religion. Now it's a different story. We're getting toward the one world religion type thing to get to the days of the Antichrist. But historically, that's how it is. Each nation has their own religion. So now, instead of the whole world knowing the truth about God, knowing that he exists, our national religion in the United States right now is atheism. So, which is the best religion of them all, because now we don't have to answer to God. But in a way, that's good, because then we don't use our energies to go against God, because we just say he doesn't exist. Whereas in the Tower of Babel, they used their energies to go against God because they knew he existed. And so then God's ability to save man from his sins would have been taken away if God didn't create nationalism. So now man's focus is on war with each other. And you notice when the world gets bad another time, so it got bad in the first time, God destroys the whole world, Noah and the flood. Then the next time, he creates nationalism, he scatters man. Well, then the next time it happens, man is so bad against God, that's when he uses the nation of Israel, and Israel is supposed to destroy the other nations. And what's beautiful about that is that war goes with the lust of the flesh. I realize you got people say, oh, peace and not, love, not war and all this. But really, if the thought of every man's heart is only evil continually, then if you have war, that gets out, that's that bloodlust. It satisfies the lust of the flesh to be able to go and kill somebody. One of the commandments of God is thou shalt not kill. Well, the reason that commandment is there is because man, in his wickedness, wants to kill the other man. Because that way he can be God. If he can get rid of everybody else, then he's the only one. So then no one can tell him what to do, and he's God. So it satisfies the bloodlust. It satisfies the flesh for you to go to war and to kill other people. I realize that gets lost, in a nation when you're part of an army and you're sent there because the nation sends you. I understand that. But still, you look at Israel, they're following the lust of their flesh. And then all these wars start because they're supposed to go against these other nations and completely wipe them out. But because they're in rebellion, Israel is in rebellion against God, then God doesn't allow them to wipe out the other nations. And then the other nations win, and there's just this back and forth going. And now there's all this hatred. And look at the world today. Maybe there isn't World War III going on right now, and they've stopped that, but it's just so much hatred out there. That's why all these violent video games, violent movies, gross things in Hollywood that they come up with, that satisfies our bloodlust, watching it on the screen. And then you get other nations, like in the Middle East, there's always war over there, going against each other. It satisfies the lust of the flesh to do that, and in so doing, it keeps man from uniting against God. So before at the Tower of Babel, man's focus was, I'm going to be like God, and they figure if we all pull together as a team, then we can defeat God and take over. And as God says, again, they're not going to be able to defeat God, but they would defeat God's plan to save man, because man would be like God. And so he would say, I don't need to recognize I'm a sinner because I'm not a sinner. I'm God. I don't recognize that I'm evil. I don't recognize that I need a savior. I'm okay the way I am. Look at what I have accomplished. I have built this tower. I have reached to heaven. Would they have literally been able to reach to heaven? It appears that way. And I don't know how all that works, but God stopped them from being able to do that. I don't think it's a physical thing that they had to do. I think heaven is in a different dimension. It's in a spiritual realm. So they would have reached it in their own wickedness, building that tower to heaven to reach God. They would have succeeded in that. They would have become so wicked, they would have overthrown God's plan to save them. And so they would have entered that spiritual realm, but would have been on the evil side. And then God would have had to judge all of man to hell, just like he does with the devil and his angels. And so God creates nationalism. And here we are, 4,000 years later, and the world hasn't been destroyed. The world, in the first 2,000 years of man's existence, the world was destroyed with the flood. And it was so bad that God could have destroyed it again. After that, though, it's just nations. Sodom and Gomorrah, God destroys them because they're so evil. And then when you get to Israel's day, God doesn't just destroy nations, because then he'd be destroying nations all the time. but he uses Israel to try to destroy them. And then when Israel becomes evil, then he gets other nations to destroy Israel. And he doesn't actually destroy all these nations. I mean, there's remnants left over. Usually there are remnants left over, especially with Israel. And it shows because God said in Genesis 12, when he divided the world into nations, he told Abraham that I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless those that bless you and curse those who curse you. And all the families of the earth will be blessed in you. It's like when you have this war with man against man, what it does is it creates in people at least and it's going to be a small remnant, and it always is, but it's not the entire world united against God. There will be some people, not many, but just a few, who in the midst of all this war recognize that man is not God. And they recognize that man is a sinner by looking at the evil that man is doing to each other in that war. See, man is biased when it comes to man against God. Man thinks he's great. You don't see God, so you think, okay, well, I'm better than God. I can be like God. And so all of man can unite against God and say, we're going to overthrow him. But all of man is not going to unite against other men. When we had the Vietnam War, there were protesters here. When in any war, there are always going to be some people who say, well, we're not any better, nationalism and pride and all that. In America, we have the Pledge of Allegiance and we, stand up for our country. But there's always going to be people who aren't patriots, who say, what America is doing is not right, or whatever nation you're in, whatever England's doing is not right, or whatever Germany is doing is not right, or whatever's going on. There are going to be people who are sickened by the evilness of war, so that they don't go along with that. As a result, they see how wicked man is. They recognize their sin and their need for a Savior. And that's how God can say to Abram, all families of the earth will be blessed in you. So he ends up cursing a lot of people, but he blesses some people. And there are going to be some people, remnants from every family of the earth, from every nation. All of those 70 nations that are listed in Genesis 10. There are going to be people who survive. Isn't that amazing to think about that? That the whole earth is destroyed in 10 generations under Noah. And then 5 generations later, in the days of Eber, the whole earth is wicked and rebels against God. God creates nations, and nationalism results in 5 generations after Eber, Abram being raised up and being a guy who loves the Lord. The nationalism and the war causes an Abram to believe that he is a sinner and to trust in God for salvation. And so out of these wars and out of this nationalism, all families of the earth, all those 70 nations that started in Genesis 10, there are going to be believers at least 4,000 years later in God's kingdom. And it's all thanks to war. It's all thanks to nationalism. That God gets man to stop his focus against God to try to beat God, and instead gets man to destroy man. That gets the bloodlust out of man. It's sort of like the design of sex when you think about it, because God says Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, it's better that you stay as I am, be single, because you can devote your energies to God. The problem is most people are going to burn with sexual lust, and then they won't devote their energies to God. Instead, they will devote their ways to sexual promiscuity, sexual sins, fornication. And so God says it is better to marry than to burn. So now you got to be married, and now you've got to please your spouse. And that's the things of the flesh, so you're not devoting your energies toward God, but you're working out some of the fleshly things so that at least you won't be completely evil, and that you will recognize that you are not God. If you don't believe that, just ask your spouse, and your spouse will tell you that. And then maybe you'll believe the gospel. And God did the same thing on a bigger scale with nationalism. It was by creating those nations, then man recognizes that he is not God, which is a lesson that man did not learn at the Tower of Babel. And so as a result, there will be some people, and granted it's going to be a remnant, but there will be some people who believe the gospel, receive the gift of eternal life. And if God did not create nations that would war against each other and get that bloodlust out, the lust of the flesh, for people to realize how evil man is, then it never would have happened. People never would have been saved. So, yeah, war is a bad thing, and I mean from a physical perspective, but spiritually speaking, if it wasn't for men warring against each other, God would have to keep destroying the earth, and no one would be saved. So, nationalism and war, in view of eternity and in the spiritual kingdom, is a very good thing. Thanks for watching.